The train sat motionless on the tracks outside the town of Schwabhausen, its line of boxcars stretching across the Bavarian countryside like a scar left behind by retreating forces. The afternoon sun was low, casting long shadows across the fields as a patrol from the U.S. 12th Armored Division approached the rail line on April 27, 1945. The men expected enemy resistance. They expected sporadic sniper fire or a delaying action from German troops falling back toward Munich. What they did not expect was silence, an unnatural stillness surrounding the train, except for the occasional creak of metal settling in the warmth of the day. The soldiers advanced cautiously until one man climbed onto the first car, slid open the door, and froze. Inside, dozens of emaciated prisoners stared back. Some were too weak to lift their heads. Others lay so still the soldiers weren't sure if they were alive. The smell hit next, a suffocating mixture of excrement, rot, and sickness that poured out of the rail car and left several men gagging as they backed away. More doors were forced open, and the same scene repeated itself down the line. Hundreds of people were crammed into the train: Jews, political prisoners, anyone the Nazis had chosen to empty from Dachau as the Allies closed in. Many were dead. Many more were close to it. The patrol called for assistance, and more American troops converged on the rails, bringing medics and water cans. Prisoners who could still move crawled toward the openings, their limbs thin as sticks, faces hollow and sunken, eyes unfocused after days without food or water. Some reached out with trembling hands, whispering in German, Hungarian, and Yiddish. Others simply stared at the ground, too weak to understand they were no longer under guard. The soldiers tried to lift people gently from the cars, but their bodies were so fragile that even a careful touch made them flinch in pain. One medic wrote later that the prisoners looked like walking skeletons draped in rags, barely breathing. The Americans searched for guards and found none on the immediate scene. But the state of the prisoners and the way some bodies had been thrown aside in the corner of certain cars left little doubt about what had been happening in the hours before the patrol arrived. The train had left Dachau with nearly 2,000 prisoners, meant to be moved deeper into Germany. Instead, it became stranded on the tracks as fuel and coordination collapsed in the final days of the war. Without food or water, people began to die where they sat. Some froze during the night, others collapsed from exhaustion or illness. By the time the Americans found the train, hundreds were dead, and the survivors were barely clinging to life. Word traveled quickly to nearby units. When elements of the 157th Infantry Regiment of the U.S. 45th Division arrived, many of the men had already seen combat from North Africa to France. They had witnessed death before, but nothing prepared them for Dachau, and the train outside Schwabhausen was only the beginning. As they moved along the tracks and followed the route back toward the camp itself, the soldiers could feel tension rising among the ranks. Some grew quiet, others cursed under their breath. A few began to shake with anger they couldn't contain. The closer they came to the camp's outer perimeter, the clearer the signs became. Bodies lay beside the road, some shot, others collapsed from starvation. The smell of death grew stronger. Prisoners who had escaped the stalled transport limped through the countryside, waving bits of cloth or stumbling toward the soldiers with their last strength. The men helped who they could, but many collapsed before medics could even reach them. When the 45th reached the outskirts of Dachau, they found boxcars on the siding near the camp filled with more bodies, stacked in layers, some still warm from the hours before. The scene outside the crematorium broke whatever restraint remained among some of the troops. They saw guards surrendering with their hands up, still wearing clean uniforms, still well-fed, still armed moments before. The contrast between the perpetrators and the victims was too stark to ignore. Witnesses later described American soldiers escorting groups of SS guards to the wall. Shots rang out. Some guards fell where they stood. Others tried to flee and were cut down. Officers attempted to regain control, but the rage spreading through the ranks was almost impossible to quell. The men had walked through rooms piled with corpses, past maintenance pits filled with bodies, and alongside railway cars where prisoners had died clawing at the doors. They had seen children barely alive, women so weak they could not stand, and men who had lost everything but the instinct to survive. In those moments, discipline broke for some, replaced by the overwhelming need to respond to what they had witnessed. Inside the camp, surviving prisoners cried, laughed, or collapsed from relief as the soldiers moved through the barracks. Some clung to the Americans, unable to release their grip even when medics tried to pry their hands loose to treat them. Others wandered in a daze, touching the gates or the fences, as if confirming the camp's control had truly ended. American medics and chaplains worked around the clock, organizing food, water, and emergency treatment. But the damage done by years of starvation and abuse was more than any army could reverse in a day. Hundreds died even after liberation, their bodies finally giving out after holding on for too long. At the train outside Schwabhausen, American troops and German civilians were ordered to bury the dead. The surviving prisoners, too weak to move far, watched from blankets as teams carried bodies from the boxcars to hastily dug graves. For many soldiers, the sight left a mark that stayed with them long after the war. Diaries written in the days that followed spoke of nightmares, guilt, and memories they wished they could erase. They described the weight of lifting bodies that seemed lighter than a child, and the agony of trying to comfort someone who knew they were too far gone to be saved. Years later, the men who had been there struggled to explain the moment the train was opened and the light fell across the prisoners for the first time. Some said it felt like stepping into another world. Others said it was the moment they realized what the war had truly been about. Few ever forgot the expressions on the faces inside those cars, the thin hands reaching out, the desperate eyes staring back, and the quiet that filled the air before the first prisoner whispered a single word: water. For the soldiers of the 12th and 45th, the liberation of the Dachau train became one of the defining moments of their service. It was the day they confronted the reality of the camps with their own eyes, and the day some of them lost their ability to hold back the anger the war had built inside them. They brought out the survivors, they buried the dead, and they carried the memory for the rest of their lives, long after the war ended, and the rail line outside Schwabhausen returned to quiet fields and passing trains that no longer carried the weight of human suffering. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.